In this tutorial, I want to continue with the subject of shape manipulation. In part 1, I described the various forms of shapes called splines in Title Studio, how to create them and how to manipulate them. There wasn't enough time to progress further with the subject of what I call spline editing. That's the mechanisms involved in modifying the basic spline into a custom shape. At the most complex, this requires a working knowledge of how to use Bezier and tangent handles to create the various forms of curve. In this part, I'll be describing these mechanisms and also attempting to demystify the subject of Bezier and tangent curves. I'll be dealing briefly with the Composite display grid option and showing how this can help position shapes accurately. Finally, I want to show how a spline can be used to create a custom lower third. Please note that I am using Title Studio within Continuum version 2021.5. Your version's UI might be slightly different. As I mentioned in episode 3, be aware that there are parts of certain workflows where specific actions will cause the application to crash. When I reach this point in the tutorial, I'll describe these actions so they can be avoided. I'll also describe any available workarounds. You also need to be aware that some interactions with objects in the workspace can be a bit frustrating. You'll see what I mean by that when they're encountered. Welcome to episode 4, part 2 in this series on Title Studio. Before I start, I want to deal again with terminology. This is important because I'll be dealing with parts of spline objects that can be misinterpreted, leading to confusion. With this in mind, I'm going to list these parts and give a definition of them. Spline object. This is a shape that consists of at least 3 nodes, called cusps, which are connected with lines called splines. Cusps. These are the nodes that connect splines together. I may refer to these as cusp points from time to time. It's worth noting that Boris FX documentation commonly referred to these as control points. Splines. These are the lines that, along with cusps, make up the periphery of the spline object. I'll refer to these splines as spline segments. Smooth point. This is a cusp which has 2 Bezier handles connected to it. Tangent point. This is a cusp which has 1 Bezier handle connected to it. The handle can be connected to either side. Control point. In some parts of the tutorial, I may refer to cusps that have 1 or 2 Bezier handles as control points. I'll assume that you've already watched part 1 and are familiar with the various ways of creating spline media. With that assumption, I'm going to start by creating a simple spline object, a rectangle. You can see that the rectangle has 8 sizing handles, which are used for basic manipulation. I covered this in part 1, so I won't elaborate on this here. To manipulate the shape further, it's necessary to expose the cusps. You do this by selecting the pen tool. This shows the 4 cusps that make up the rectangle. A spline object consists of a number of straight splines, hence the term spline object, connected by cusps. The more complex the spline object, the more splines and cusps there are. You noticed I said that the splines were straight, and this is mostly true. However, cusps can be converted into control points, which are either smooth points or tangent points. Now back to the rectangle. You can see that 3 of the cusps seem hollow, whilst the 4th is solid. The solid one signifies that it's the last cusp in the spline. To perform any kind of operation on an individual cusp, it must be selected. Cusps are selected by clicking on them with the pen tool. The selected cusp will turn red and the previously selected cusp will turn back to white. You'll notice that the spline object's periphery is normally red, but turns yellow when the mouse pointer is over it. You can only use the pen on the object when the periphery is yellow. If you try to use it when it's red, you'll initiate another spline. Now I'll make some simple changes to the object's shape. In order to use the pen tool to make these changes, a timeline entry must be selected that allows that. You'll know when a correct entry is selected because the spline periphery will be coloured red. To change the shape of the spline, hover the mouse over its periphery so that it changes to yellow. Then click anywhere on the periphery. This will expose the cusp points. To move a cusp, hover over it with the mouse. When the periphery turns yellow, click on the cusp. This must turn red before it can be moved. If it doesn't turn red, release the mouse and move it slightly but still on the cusp, then click again. When it turns red, you can hold the mouse button down and drag the cusp to a new location. You can also nudge a cusp using the keyboard arrow keys. By nudge, I mean 1 pixel at a time. To nudge a cusp, first select it, then hold the control key down while using the arrow keys. By selecting multiple cusps, you can nudge all the selected cusps. When dragging a cusp, if you hold the Shift key down, the movement will be limited to the horizontal or vertical directions. How this works is a little fiddly, but I'll try to explain. You first select the cusp for moving. It will then turn red. Now press and hold the Shift key down, then click the red cusp and drag it. It'll either move only vertical or only horizontal. Whichever way it moves, if it's the wrong way, release the Shift key and the mouse button, then repeat the procedure. The Shift key acts like a toggle for the direction. As you can see, it's a little bit fiddly. You need to be a little careful when using the Shift key. Multiple cusps can be collectively selected by holding it down while selecting. You could inadvertently move more than the one you wanted to. To create more complex shapes, it's necessary to add cusps to the spline. How many depends upon the complexity required. This is how you add cusps to the spline. You will hover the pen over the spline's periphery where you want to add a cusp. Press and hold the Alt key and click. A smooth point, that's one with 2 Bezier handles, will be created at that point. I don't really want to deal with Bezier handles just yet, so I'm going to convert this smooth point into a cusp. I do this by selecting the smooth point. Remember, it must turn red. Then I go to Tools on the menu bar and select Cusp Points. I can now drag this cusp point away to change the spline's shape. At this point, it would be convenient to deal with the extra tools that show up on the toolbar when a spline object is selected. I'll start with the Scissors tool. As its name implies, this tool allows a spline's path to be cut. This can be useful if you have closed a spline object, then find that you need to open it again to continue building it. It's important to note that a spline segment, that's a spline between two cusp points, can't be cut. The cut must be made at a cusp point. Now, the procedure is a little tricky, but with some practice it's fairly easy to achieve. I'm first going to disable the Fill On setting. The procedure will be easier to see when the spline object has no fill. With the cusp point showing, I'll select the Scissors tool. You'll notice that the mouse cursor changes to a cross. With the cusp point showing and the Scissors tool selected, I can click on the cusp to be cut. Remember, the periphery must be yellow. The cusp will change to one infilled with white. This signifies that it is now the last cusp in the spline object. Now I can select the pen tool and drag the white cusp away. Be aware that there's a bit of a problem with the Scissors tool. If you select a spline object by clicking on it in the composite display, then try to select a cusp, you'll fail to do so. Let me show you. There's a workaround for this. Instead of selecting the spline object in the composite display, select the spline object entry in the timeline controls section. I told you it was a little tricky. To continue the spline, hold the Alt key down whilst creating more cusp points. When complete, drag the last cusp point onto the other open cusp point and release the mouse. The two cusp points will then merge. Next comes the hollow arrow tool. This functions the same as the solid arrow tool, but only on spline objects. Considering the hollow arrow tool only appears when a spline object is selected, that statement seems a little superfluous. The next one down is the spline rotate tool. This tool provides an on-screen method of rotating spline objects. Dragging the corner handle of a spline object will rotate the spline. As you can see, the same problem occurs with this tool as I described with the scissors tool. If you select a spline object by clicking on it in the composite display, then try to grab a corner handle to rotate it, you'll find that it's impossible. You must select the spline object in the timeline control section for the procedure to work. Now we come to the mirror mode tool. This tool works in conjunction with the spline rotate tool and only affects multiple selected spline objects. With two or more spline objects selected and this tool enabled, rotating one of the splines with the spline rotate tool will result in all spline objects rotating around their own center. With the mirror mode tool disabled, all spline objects will rotate around the rotating spline object center. Now to deal with Bezier handles. For those who have no experience with Bezier handles, these are lines that extend away from a cusp point and have a control node at the end of the lines. The position of the nodes and the length of the lines determine the curvature of the segments that connect to the cusp. As I mentioned earlier, a control point can be either a smooth point or a tangent point. I'll deal with smooth points first. I've already shown how to create a smooth point. This is when you add a cusp point to a spline object. You can also convert a cusp into a smooth point by first selecting it, then going to the menu bar and selecting Tools, then Smooth Points. You can also use the shortcut key Y. This method can also be used to convert multiple selected cusps. Be careful when using this method though. You must ensure that the composite window has focus for this to work. Let me explain. If you select a cusp to convert, you can go to Tools and see that both commands are available, including their shortcut key allocation. However, if you then switch focus away from the composite window, then look under Tools again, you'll see that the two commands are greyed out and unavailable. So, to ensure that the commands and shortcut key commands work, you should first make sure that the desired cusps are selected, then make sure that the composite window has focus. The latter is true when the composite window has a yellow border. Another way of converting a selected cusp into a smooth point is to hold the Control key down whilst dragging away from the cusp. You can also convert all the cusps in a spline object in one go. To do this, you must first select all the cusps. This is achieved by hovering the mouse over any of the spline segments so that they turn yellow. Then press and hold the Shift key down and left click. All the cusps should now be red, signifying that they are selected. With all cusps selected, go to Tools and select Smooth Points or press the shortcut key Y. Now the smooth point has been created, let's see how manipulating the Bezier handles create different curves around the point. By dragging a Bezier node, you can alter the shape of the curve. Remember, you must ensure that the spline segments are yellow before you attempt to drag the node. By default, both handles will move in unison, but in opposite directions to each other. But if you hold the Alt key down whilst moving a node, the opposite node will remain still. Okay, so that's smooth points. Now for the other type, tangent points. A tangent point is similar to a smooth point, but it only has one Bezier handle. To create a tangent point, select a cusp point, then hold the Alt key down whilst clicking and pulling the mouse away from the cusp. One Bezier handle will be created. To remove the tangent point, select it, then go to the Tools menu and select Cusp Points. You can also press the shortcut key U. I think that's enough about splines for now. It should have given you enough information to be able to have a go at creating shapes. How complex those shapes will be will depend upon your imagination and creativity. I now want to talk about the composite display grid. This isn't present by default. It needs to be enabled by selecting the on-screen controls icon and selecting Grid. You can also enable the grid by selecting Preview, then Show Grid. You won't see the grid until there's an object being displayed, so I'll create a rectangle. The colour of the grid lines is set in the Grids and Guides palette, which can be displayed by selecting Window, then Show Grids and Guides palette. The first thing to say about the grid is this: it's far too busy. We can sort that out shortly. The next thing concerns the Snap to Grid setting. With this setting enabled, objects can be moved, then snapped into place at specific locations. Unfortunately, you can't snap a spline object when sizing handles are displayed. It's actually the red and green arrows that snap into position, which can make positioning quite tricky. So you need to be in spline track mode. Referring to the grid, you'll see that it's made up of large squares overlaying smaller squares which contain even smaller squares. The important thing to note is that it's the lines making up the large squares that the red and green arrows snap to. So, to get the large squares small enough to make snapping feasible, some customization is required. To do this, open up the Grids and Guidelines palette by selecting Window, then Show Grids and Guidelines palette. This window displays many parameters that affect the way the grid looks. I'm not going to go through all these settings, but what I'll do is change the settings that affect the number of grid lines and how small the main squares are. Bear in mind though, these modified settings are for 1920 by 1080 aspect ratio. For anyone wishing more detail on grid and title safe settings, I've detailed these in an appendix that I'll play after my conclusion. I'll start by setting the grid style to dashed instead of solid. This will make the grid look less busy. The next thing is to change the grid subdivisions to 2. Finally, I'll change the horizontal and vertical grid cells settings to 12 and 8 respectively. Now I'll use the rectangle to demonstrate snapping. I need to check that grid snapping is enabled. I can do that by checking the Snap to Grid checkbox in the Grids and Guides palette, or by clicking Preview, then Snap to Grid. Now I need to select the spline track entry and select the arrow tool. If I move the object using the arrows, you'll see the arrows snap into position onto the grid lines. I now want to demonstrate the construction of a simple lower third using a text object and a spline object. I'll first create the lower third background strip. This will be a simple rectangle that has a slanted end. I'll then use a tangent point to make the slanted end slightly curved. Using the rectangle tool, I'll draw an elongated rectangle in approximately the right size and position for the lower third. The final size and position will be determined later. Now I need to expose the cusps, so I'll select the pen tool. To create the slanted end, I need to select the top right-hand cusp, which will turn red, hold Shift key down and pull the cusp to the left. How far to move the cusp is down to personal preference. I may decide that I've made the spline height too much. In that case, I need to pull both cusps down to the correct height. I could pull them down individually, but I would have to adjust and readjust in order to get the horizontal line perfectly horizontal. There's an easier way to do this though. I'll first select the arrow tool, which will expose the sizing handles. I can then click on the top middle handle, hold the Alt key down and pull the handle down. This can get so frustrating. Now to continue. Hold the Alt key down and resize. This will pull the top line down without disturbing the bottom line. Next, I want to make the slanted end rounded. I can quickly do this by selecting the cusp with the pen tool, then holding the Alt key down while I drag horizontally to the right. This creates a tangent point and some tweaking may be required to get the desired result. And I want to change the fill colour. To do this, I'll select the Controls window, then the Fill tab. The fill colour should complement the scene that the lower third is to be applied, so that's something I can't decide. For this demonstration, I'll select a nice shade of blue. Now, I always like my lower third background to be slightly transparent. It allows the scene to partially show through. 70% opacity is a reasonable value, So I'll enter this into the fill opacity setting. One last thing, I like my background to have a white border, so I'll select the border tab and click on a border number checkbox. Now I'll change the colour to white. Finally, I need to increase the edge width setting. To better see the result of this, I need to click off the spline, which will hide the cusps. "12" is a reasonable setting. To see the result, I'll click on the spline track entry. Now for the text. I'll click on the text tool, then in the Composite window I'll type my text string. There's something odd going on there, but we'll sort that out. I'm going to type that in again. Oh dear. I've crashed the application. To be continued. I'm back with you. The reason I crashed Vegas Pro is because I failed to observe one of my golden rules from episode 3. If you use the text tool to type into the Composite window, then try to edit that text in the text window, the application will crash, along with its host. Boris FX know about this issue and will fix it as soon as possible. Meanwhile, we have to use the workaround, which is to select the solid arrow tool before editing the text in the text window. I forgot that issue and paid the price. Anyway, back to getting a string into the lower third. To avoid further issues, I'm going to create the text a different way. I'll be using the Add New Media button in the Timeline Control section, and I'll select the flat text option. After I've selected that option, I'm going to make sure that the text point size is reasonable. 34 seems reasonable enough at the moment. Now I'll change the default string to the string that I want to be in the lower third. I now have to make suitable changes to the text. Again, this will be down to personal preference, but I always like to have a nice readable font such as Times New Roman, which this is. Just a little tip, a quick way to get to your chosen font is to type the first letter, then scroll. For the font colour, I choose yellow with a black border. The font colour is changed by clicking this icon here, highlighting the text, and using the colour swatch to change. As far as the border is concerned, I need to leave this until the size of the text is established. The next thing I want to do is resize the text string to fit into the spline object. There are a number of ways to do this. You can alter the font point size, but that's a little tedious. You can also use the scale down button, which is less tedious. I have to highlight the text first. You can also open the controls window and use the master scale value. I'll now use the Translate interactor to move the text into the spline object. I can now set the border colour and width. To do this, I need to select the Material track entry. If it's not already selected, then the Border tab. I can then select a border number, leave the border colour as black, and change the edge width if needed. And now I can zoom in and check it. I'll now change the preview background to show how it looks over the media. Remember me talking about the track structure being hierarchical? Let me show you one of the benefits of this. Say for instance that you've designed a fancy lower third, but find out too late that it's not quite in the right position. Fortunately, because the spline and text entries are both encompassed by the scene container, it's possible to move all the objects at once. To do this, select the scene entry and you should see the transformation arrows for the scene. Simply use these arrows to reposition the complete lower third. You can also use the scale interactor if you need to scale the lower third. So that's the final part dealing with the creation, manipulation and modification of spline objects and spline primitives. My apologies for the hiccups along the way. The only excuse I have is that I'm still learning Title Studio and I, like you, get frustrated from time to time. In the next episode I want to explore extruded text. I'll also be dealing with bevels and material styles. Title Studio comes equipped with dozens of inbuilt material styles to use on extruded text, but I want to show you how to use any image and convert it into a custom material style. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks also if you subscribed. Until the next time, bye for now. The Grids and Guides palette. The grid consists of multiple vertical and horizontal lines and is customized using the Grids and Guides palette window. This window, if not already open, can be opened by clicking on Window, then selecting Show Grids and Guides palette. Note that the window will open and be tabbed with the currently selected window. OK, let's start at the top. The line colour is determined by the grid colour setting. The default colour is green, with RGB values of 0, 128 and 0. Guidelines will have a colour determined by the guide colour setting, which by default has the RGB values of 128, 128 and 255. Grid style refers to the grid line style. It can be either solid, dashed or dotted. In my humble opinion, solid lines make the grid look too cluttered. Dotted lines result in the subdivision lines being removed and the grid lines replaced by regular dots. With this setting, I don't think there's enough detail. The dashed lines option seems to be a reasonable compromise. The guide style options are the same as for the grid style. Having used the guides on occasions, I would recommend leaving this at the default solid setting. Grid pixel spacing refers to the distance in pixels between individual grid lines. The default value of 80 for a 1920 by 1080 resolution results in a 24 by 13.5 grid. It's important to note that, when Snap into Grid is enabled, objects do not snap to these guidelines. Grid subdivisions determine how the grid lines are subdivided. The default value of 4 results in the grid cells being divided into groups of 16. Horizontal grid cells. This value determines how the grid cells are divided horizontally across the display. When Snap into Grid is enabled, objects will snap to the grid lines that are created by this value. Note though that moving the spline at spline object level will not snap. The vertical grid cells parameter will have the same effect as the horizontal grid cells value, but in the vertical direction. Snap sensitivity. These two values determine how objects react when being snapped to the grid. The higher the value, the more the object will resist being moved off its snapped location. Similarly, the higher the value, the more the object will pull to the next snapping location when being moved. Be careful adjusting these values, as too high a value will make object movement difficult. The default value of 25 seems to be reasonable. The two checkboxes determine whether Snap to Grid and Snap to Guides are enabled. These two parameters can also be changed by selecting Preview from the menu bar. The Action and Title Safe Area values change the way they are displayed in the composite display. These values are critical where monitors and televisions with cathode ray tubes are concerned, but not so critical for modern displays.